Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I had the pleasure to listen to the last panel, and there are a number of things that very much resonates with some of the things that I'll cover today. So first of all, thanks so much for the invitation. Thanks for this incredible lineup, really, of topics in the last few days. I've been able to listen to a few of them. And I really do wish we were in a pre-COVID area where we could all be there together, because I think there's a lot there that we can learn from each other. And clearly, financial crime is evolving very quickly from a technology perspective, from a regulatory developments perspective. And so I've been invited today to talk about high level, to kick off and to follow on some of the topics that we discussed just previously. Some global regulatory developments that we're seeing. We'll touch very briefly on some industry trends that we're seeing, and we'll pick up on some of the efforts that we're doing in making to touch on the issue of how do we increase effectiveness, and I'll get into that in more detail. Effectiveness, not just from a technical perspective, but even from an information sharing and a political and policy engagement perspective. My name is, again, Sidanius, Global Head of Financial Crime and Industry Affairs. I'm also the chair of the Europe chapter of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, and I'll introduce that group in a moment. But if I can move to the next slide and just do some scene setting. This is not new to any of us who've been in this space for a while, but clearly financial crime as a topic has only gathered momentum in the last several years, and it's really reached at the highest political level now. We see it constantly mentioned in G7 communiques and G20 communiques. We also see it reflected in some pretty substantial legislative policy engagements as well. Just 2 days ago, the European Commission published what I consider to be the most comprehensive AML package in recent memory that really digs up the road on really trying to focus on some key issues and key topics that need to be addressed, and we'll cover those briefly in a few moments. We also know in the US that the US AML Act of 2020, which again is probably the most comprehensive legislative package since the US Patriot Act, also focuses a number of attentions on some key topics as well, and we'll cover those. And what we also see it in other dimensions. Even the Vatican has been implicated in a 350 million euro scandal in the London real estate market. They've also been implicated on luxury goods that have been bought from a source that was actually meant to free hostages. We've also seen increased sanctions from the perspective of fighting human trafficking and human rights. And that's gathered a pace. In the last year alone, from 2019 to 2020, we've seen a 62% increase in sanctions in this space. And then, of course, we've seen the impact of COVID-19 overall on not only online fraud, virtual fraud, but corruption and other issues as well, particularly in the healthcare sector and many other sectors as well. And then we all know, of course, nothing new about the increased attention on crypto firms as well. So this just sets the scene. These are issues that I'm sure resonate with all of you. They're not new, but they're certainly gathering a pace. And if we can move to the next slide. So there are many pieces to this menu, if you will, of topics that are of importance to us all. But I think there's three ones that are of particular interest. The first is an increased focus on the issue of modern day slavery. For those of us who've been in this field, we know that there's more slavery today than there was when slavery was actually legal. And this is an issue that's been gone unaddressed for far too long. And most of the victims, of course, are women and children. And we also see this reflected in legislative focus and law enforcement focus, and the need to really focus our attention on this topic. And this is not just the issue of laundering proceeds or illicit proceeds, but actually gets into issues like supply chain, risk management, and this needs its proper due. So I think that is one topic, and you're going to see this reflected, I suspect, in EU sanctions and US sanctions. We've seen it already on sanctions against human rights violations, for instance. So I think that is one aspect for us that I think we can do more and cooperate more. Financial crime as well is increasingly recognized that this is not an issue of compliance. This is not an issue of ticking policies or procedures of a procedural nature in terms of ensuring that you have the right control framework. But in fact, it actually it cuts to the heart of protecting the integrity of the banking system, protecting the integrity of a fair economy. And this is also reflected from a legislative perspective within the EU. For the first time, as far as I'm aware, they've made a direct link between financial crime and prudential policy. This is also, of course, at the backdrop of many banking scandals in Denmark, for instance, with Danske Bank and others. They're certainly not the only ones, but there's a recognition, particularly in many jurisdictions, where the banking assets, the combined banking assets of that country, is far exceeds the GDP. So that if the tier 1 or tier 2 bank in that particular country has financial stability issues or revenue issues associated with a run on a bank, for instance, then that actually could cascade into a banking crisis overall. So I think that is an important lesson for us, and also will increase the attention at the political level, we suspect, in the next coming years. The last one, and certainly not the only one, and there's many that we could add here as well, but environmental, or what we at Refinitiv call green crime. The pandemic has been a watershed event on this issue. Because of reports, of course, we all know that COVID-19 really spread out or came out of the illegal wildlife trafficking and wet markets in parts of the world. And of course, we've all seen the impact that the pandemic has had on our life, on our economies, our families, and where we all find ourselves today. So you will see a real focus on environmental crime in particular. We've seen that already in a G20 statement just a few weeks ago. We've also seen that with the Financial Action Task Force that recently published a report in July on this issue. And we ourselves as a company highlighted what we call green crime. Green crime is a term really to recognize that many of these facets, environmental criminal aspects, are interconnected. Illegal fishing, illegal logging, many of these parts, wildlife trafficking, are interconnected. The same criminal networks are being used, and it's global. We've made that a specific topic for us even before the pandemic, where we launched an event on this topic at the annual meeting in Davos in January of last year. And of course, with the pandemic now, we've only seen that the interest in this topic only accelerate. And if I can share with you a few polls on this, if we can move to the next slide. So throughout the year, as we've had a number of events and topics to discuss green crime again, and the impact of it, the impact that it has on our biodiversity, the impact that it has on our supply chain. And we've done these polls for a number of different industries and sectors. This is not just the compliance sector, not just the capital market sector like wealth managers, traders, institutional investor sector. And the answer to fairly basic questions was quite profound, and I suspect was only reflected, from the fact of where we all are. So the first question is, do you think that green crime is a threat to peace and security? Over 80% said yes. I would suspect that if we posed this question a few years ago, it would, the results would be nowhere near what we found on this point. The second question, do you think that green crime should receive equal attention as money laundering and terrorism financing? Similar results, quite astounding results. And lastly, and this is the one that really reflected and resonates on why environmental crime, again, I think is going to be a key driver in terms of what our policy focus is going to be. That's going to resonate in terms of what our compliance focus is going to be. Should the International Criminal Court, in fact, add the term ecocide to the list of international crimes, like crimes against humanity, for instance. And again, a similar result, over 80% said yes. And again, if we had conducted this poll a few years ago, way before the pandemic, then I suspect there would have been a sort of head scratching about, well, environmental crime. I'm not quite sure really where to begin. Is that really a focus of ours? But clearly, the socialization of the awareness raising of the effect that the environmental damage has, not just in terms of doing something sustainable for the future and how to allocate capital for the future, but in fact how criminals and financial crime has an impact on our environment. That issue is now forefront of many of our minds. And if you turn to the next slide, and I'll go through this very, very briefly. You've heard before in the previous session about some trends in terms of how to use technology, how it's deployed, what the risks are, what the opportunities are. So I'm not going to go into this in detail. I'll leave these slides for you that I'm sure it will be shared afterwards. But we recently at Refinitiv released a risk and compliance report a few weeks ago that gets into some of the detail about the risks that we're currently seeing, but also the benefits that we're also seeing. So I will let you peruse these next few slides in due course, but let me, in the interest of time, focus on the next section. So if we just skip to the Global Coalition, and then we'll one more. So I will end with this. So we all know what the problems are. The system is ineffective, it's costly, it's not achieving the results that we want. So we're all trying in our own silos to deploy better technology, to find better ways of working, to use machine learning, artificial intelligence, as we do as a company. But there's a bigger question here. And the question then is, how do we collectively find a platform in a way for us to discuss what actually are systemic issues? So together with the World Economic Forum and Europol, we formed a global coalition to fight financial crime, and have since grown. And the real objectives was to, let's raise awareness that financial crime, as I've laid out in the early parts of this presentation, it's not a compliance issue anymore. We need to recognize it, that it has social costs, societal costs, and we need to raise this issue at the highest political level and to engage with policymakers in the best way we can. We're big promoters of information sharing in the various manifestations, whether at the operational level or certainly sharing information in terms of typologies and where we see the risks and behavioral risks, where we see those trends. And also identify best practices and best approaches. We all have different pieces in the system. We as a data company have a perspective in terms of what we think is effective for us and what we think we need to focus on. But we know law enforcement has their perspective, the banking community has their perspective, and many others. So how do we bring the best talent and the best expertise on many organizations who've been doing this for 30 years? And certainly we can do more to bring that, that experience to bear. Also to identify pain points and also to support initiatives that support all of those objectives. So that was the original intent. Since we launched in 2018, if we can move to the next slide, we have since grown and been quite careful, in particular in terms of maintaining a unique balance between civil society, the banking community, law enforcement, and many others to really represent the fabric of the anti-financial crime ecosystem. And since our new chair, or new as of October of last year, John Cusack, he's done a tremendous job in really carving out some very target areas that I think will resonate with this group and hopefully others as well. And while we historically have been quite focused, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, and the Americas, in the next coming year, we will turn our attention to finding partners in the Asia region. And so, we very much encourage you to reach out to us, and in particular on issues like trade-based money laundering, which is an issue and a topic that needs further attention really, and the intersection between trade-based money laundering and money laundering itself in the traditional way that we think of it. If we move to the next slide, just to give you a sense. So part of our effort of raising awareness, finding more effective ways of working together, and being very concrete on engaging with policymakers, this is essentially our executive leadership team. Again, thanks to the leadership of John Cusack, who's really been driving this framework. The focus areas: anti-corruption. That's an area that I think that lots of great work has been done, but I think more can be done to harness that. And that's led by Greta Fenner from the Basel Institute of Governance. We talked about effectiveness. Well, that is a work stream led by Rob Wainwright, former executive director at Europol. We have a focus on the Americas. I lead the Europe chapter, and then we also have Ibtisin Lassoud, who leads our MENA chapter, who's as we speak setting up a framework for more public and private information sharing in the MENA region, which is a fantastic development. So that is one example of how we're trying to drive this. We can get into maybe in the Q&A what effectiveness actually means, and I can give you our perspective on this question. But it's to give you a sense that we're trying to address something that's been unaddressed for far too long, and that is how do we collaborate together? How do we create a platform for us to both highlight what's working and what's not working, and then also engage with policymakers so they can then reflect on legislative developments in a way that enhances those things that needs more attention, and then again reduces those things that are not working. And there's many things that we can talk about in terms of enhancing the suspicious transaction reporting regime, which is not working, and we can go on and on and on. And if I reflect on this concept of information sharing and collaboration, let's move to the next slide. The Global Coalition is one way to do it, and it's one way to do it with senior policymakers, which we continue to do. We've done that with the European Commission, for instance, with its own action plan. We've done it in the US, and we've done it in many other regions as well. But there's also an operational aspect that we're also proud to work with many organizations out there in terms of how do we use our data in a more effective way? How do we work collaboratively with organizations who have experience, boots on the ground, and insight that will enhance our capability as well? And these are just 4 examples. The first is the Sentry. The Sentry, co-founded by George Clooney, to look at corruption in sub-Saharan Africa. They have tremendous capability, tremendous insight, and so we formed a data partnership with them for them to share their research and their analysis that we then ingest, as long as they meet our inclusion criteria, that we ingest in our product WorldCheck, and that then enables for us to distribute that information to those who want it. And the Sentry, of course, to their credit, are quite influential as well with the US Treasury. They have been specific, the thrust behind many different specific sanctions and explicit sanctions against certain individuals in that region, and that is one example of an organization that we're proud to work with. Another one, if we go from left to right, is the Freedom Seal. Freedom Seal is an organization that works with companies to look at their supply chain and then get certified that modern-day slavery doesn't exist in that supply chain. It was founded by Ronnie Hong, a former child slave herself, who's since become a UN Special Advisor and now the CEO of the Freedom Seal. So that's another example, a testament to how we'd like to work very collaboratively with companies on that topic specifically. United for Wildlife at the bottom left, led by Duke of Cambridge to look at the illegal wildlife trade. And so we're working with the 2 task forces, the Transport Task Force and the Financial Crime Task Force, in order to find a better operating model and a better data information sharing framework to enable companies to really have the best intelligence and the best data at their fingertips. So with things and topics like illegal wildlife trade, and also to be very clear on the global network of this, to identify where not only the source countries, which we all know who they are, but what are the transit points, what are the destination points, and be able to map that in a very practical way for organizations to take concrete action to shut down. And then the fourth and last is I work with the South African Integrated Task Force. This is a public-private information sharing partnership, and we're delighted to work with them, again, for the same reasons that many other information sharing partnerships, that some of the issues that they're trying to address, which is scale, scope, and coverage. And so we're working with them really to find a cohesive way, and also more specifically to be able to share our intelligence with each other, and also to provide our researchers and to combine our researchers to do joint case studies on particular topics. And of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, wildlife trafficking and human trafficking are all pertinent points and task forces that they've established to address. So these are just examples. Collaboration and increasing effectiveness can manifest themselves in many different ways, both from a policy engagement perspective, but also from an information sharing perspective. And this is something we're really believers in. We want to do more of, and we're already seeing tremendous value out of these initiatives. So I will probably end it there. Hopefully, Manesh and the team, we might have a few moments for Q&A. But again, thank you for the invitation. It's an incredible, important time for us to focus on many of these things. And I congratulate you on a fantastic conference.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shay, for sharing all of this information. And apologies for just jumping here in at the very, very end. But I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Of course.
Wonderful. So you've mentioned unique balance and of stakeholders that you have, but also effectiveness. And I was just wondering, given all of the efforts you have in advancing the collaboration and in the effectiveness in the fight against financial crime, how do you actually measure effectiveness? And what will success look like? And where is the vision of where you want to go over the next 12, 18, 24 months?
No, thanks, Brad. And that is actually a fundamental question, which is why we have with a coalition, a specific work stream just on this question. So I'll share my views on what that means. And it means different things to different people. From us, we're a data company. What effectiveness means is better data quality, more information sources, better typologies, and better networking mapping. And that means that we have to be more imaginative in terms of where we get imaginative in terms of expanding our data sources, identifying non-governmental organizations, for instance, who are doing incredible work all across the world, whether it's Liberty Shared, used to be Liberty Asia, the Sentry, and many other companies who are doing amazing work, and being able to draw on that data. The other thing for us as a data company is using more actionable data. So we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to deal with the complexity of unstructured data, which is growing exponentially. So what does that mean? That means you need to find a way to, what data do you ingest? How do you structure it? How do you distribute it? How do you analyze it? And then how do you then push it out to people to be able to use it more? So that for us is kind of what that means in effectiveness. But there's also a bigger piece. How do we find a way to make suspicious transaction reporting regime more effective? How do we standardize data taxonomies in a more effective way? An example is, sanctions. There's 65 different sanctions authorities, hundreds of different sanctions lists, all with a different naming conventions. So my name can be spelled probably 65 times 65 different ways, and which causes an immense amount of frustration and actually leads to financial exclusion at the end of it, because there's a number of individuals, depending on the region that you're in, with a very common last name, and so that causes an immense confusion. So I think this question is central. So I think that we're currently working that through in terms of getting a comprehensive view what it means for banks, NGOs, for law enforcement, for data companies like ourselves, and being able to then influence policy in a way that enables organizations to deal with many of these issues. And one of them, unfortunately, from our perspective, well, not unfortunately, but one issue that we do have to address is data privacy.
So you raise a really interesting issue there on data privacy, and I just wanted to drill down on that a little bit, especially, the conflict between data privacy regulations and AML regimes. This is obviously increasingly becoming an issue for everybody in this space and requires attention. From your perspective, how can this issue be remediated?
Yeah, no, this is going to be one of the central questions of our time. when I time, I'm saying 5 to 10 years and beyond, because we've been very engaged on this question for a number of years, and in principle, well, you should say in principle, but the privacy officers will say is that data privacy should enable the fight against financial crime. But when you get into the details, it's actually contradictory. And I'll only reflect on one letter, for instance, published on the 19th of May by the European Data Protection Board to the European Commission in anticipation of the AML package. And in it, you will see some fundamental clashes. AML tries to enhance data processing, data pooling, use of machine learning, to use it more effective, do more with less, which requires a more effective use of data, make it less manual, et cetera, versus data privacy goes the opposite direction. The principles of data privacy in its application mean it wants to limit how you process data, it wants to bifurcate the data pooling, and it wants to obscure the details of the data itself. So these are fundamental principles that we need to discuss to define what legitimate interest really means, what the public interest really means. And unfortunately, these are issues that are unresolved at the moment. And I know that this is reached at the highest political level, and David Lewis at FATF, and many have recognized the importance of this. But at the moment, there's a recognition that it's there, but we have a long way to go to understand the practical implications. Because at the moment, with the AML action plan as an example, you have potentially 10% of your global revenue at risk, and on the AML front, and 5% of your global revenues at risk with data privacy. And so, which regime do you navigate towards?
Wonderful. I mean, it's obviously a massive leap from recognition to action. But with that, thank you, Shay, so much for your discussion today. I mean, for everyone watching and joining the session, there is a call to action. The Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime is looking for greater participation and representation from Asia. So be sure to connect with Shay Sidanius via LinkedIn to find out more, or email us and we'll definitely put you in touch. Thank you once again, Shay. Up next, we have the shell game, Hiding in Plain Sight.